This is the fifth category, and I would call this accompanying literature because it doesn't actually concern itself with fashion too much. On the left we have a catalogue of the work of Vigée Brun, who painted Marie Antoinette and Luise of Prussia and lots of very famous people. So she did pastels and she did some very, very great paintings of some very famous people, and usually you can learn about fashion just from looking at her paintings. She was herself very fashion conscious, so the way she did dresses is really a treasure for any costume maker. Then a little book about Luise of Prussia, because she used to be very fashionable. She didn't live long, but she was a fashion icon. Apparently she was quite a ditz. But it's always interesting to read about the backgrounds of the people who were considered to be very fashionable, who were copied a lot and who made the fashions of their time. Then on the right we have Feuerwerk, which I would translate as fireworks. It's a book that Pauline Metternich wrote, and apparently she's a very witty, interesting writer. She was a very big number at the court of Vienna and at the court of Paris under Napoleon III, and she is the one who made Charles Frederick Worth famous. So she talks about that a little, which is why I bought the book. And then I found out that she was the funniest person on the planet. Seriously, her biographical stuff is amazing. She's a very great writer. She's good with rhetorical stuff, so she's very amusing to read. Then down in the left is a little book that my mom brought me from Russia. It's about Nikolai II and his family, and this is mostly interesting because it has a lot of pictures of his daughters in very pretty dresses and how they presented themselves in public images and stuff like this. So this is also very interesting if you're into Edwardian fashion and how those very ill-fated Romanovs presented themselves in front of their people. Then in the middle we have Geisha. I already talked about the kimono book, so I bought this one to accompany it, because this is a first-hand account of how Liza Dalby did her geisha training, and that really puts into perspective everything she knows about kimono and how she got to be so interested in Japanese culture, because you can see how she got sucked in and how strange she thought some things were and how she learned and all this kind of good stuff. And then in the lower right we have Victorian culture, which is just what it is. It's a book about Victorian culture, because you always need to do background reading. If you don't get how a certain society works, how can you remake the clothing? It's serious. You need to have background knowledge about what kind of society you're moving in when you dress up as a historical person, or just dress up in a historical piece of clothing and you want to represent. You need to know what is the image of women, what are the societal troubles of the time, what are you allowed to do, what are the morals, what are you not allowed to do, these kind of things. That's very important. The last category is newspapers and magazines, because these yield very interesting information on how people perceived fashion and what they thought about it. Especially if it's a woman's magazine, it's going to come up at some point. So up on the left we have a bound version of the best of the Gartenlaube, which was a German paper, and it has very interesting stuff like how the feminine beauty ideal is ridiculous. Of course it was written by men mostly. There's stuff about how corsets are killing the female population and who would want their woman to look like an hourglass, and the Cul de Paris looks even more ridiculous, and cannot somebody persuade this silly woman folk to not be so crazy in their fashions. Then up in the right is a bound version of a magazine for women, again from Germany, from 1926 to 27, and I already showed you this in my Reconsidering the 20s video, so I'm not going to go into too great detail, but it has some tips for the housewife and how she is supposed to run her household. Then also there's little novellas cut up in bits and pieces, so people would come back reading. And also there are fashion instructions. There aren't any patterns left in this version, but usually there would be a sewing pattern included in the magazine when you bought it. So that's pretty interesting. Then right down there is the Weltkunst, which I already used to quote in another one of my videos. And this has some pretty interesting articles on fashion. Down on the left are the ones that I just kept because there was too much good stuff in it to throw them away. Then there's an article I cut out about how to collect haute couture like it's art. And I have certain misgivings about that concept, but I kept it anyway. And down in the right are some other articles, including one about how Wolfgang Job used to kind of make his own antique paintings and sold them as actual antique paintings in order to get some money when he was broke. So that's a fun story. I recommend looking that up. That's pretty much it. This last one doesn't really fit into a category. It's just stuff I copied from books in the library, either because I couldn't afford to buy the extra book, as was the case with the opulent era. This thing's expensive. Like, I'm broke, I'm poor, technically speaking, so I can't afford to pay like 200 to 300 bucks just for one book. So I copied like the first half of it, which concerned Worth, which is my main subject of research these days, and that already cost me like 20 bucks or 30, so it's still cheaper than buying the book. And then there are some essays, like one essay I copied from Fusion Fashion, Culture Beyond Orientalism and Occidentalism, so that was a pretty good read in this essay in particular. Then there was one about fashionable queens, body, power, gender. There was one that mentioned Elizabeth of Austria that I copied, and one about Barbie that was really funny. And then there's just some stuff like this, Worth to Dior, and the one behind that is called Couture. I didn't want to bother bringing that one out. They were pretty useless, but they mentioned Worth, so I copied the bits where he was mentioned on principle, so I have them on file, and that's that. And then the last copy in the middle is The Fashion Makers, The History of Haute Couture by a German author. And that guy has quite some nerve. So there's like 50 to 60 pages about Worth and how couture got started, then about his pupil, and then like 100 pages or more about Coco Chanel and her famous rich friends and how they were famous and rich together, and it's ridiculous. And everyone after that gets subsequently fewer pages. There are like 20 more couturiers, and some of them get 1 or 2 pages per head. Like, he didn't care about couture in general, he wanted to write about Coco Chanel, and that's it. That's what he did. He wrote a little love letter to his little famous favorite designer. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I just included these essays for the sake of having this complete. And let me know in the comments what types of books you prefer regarding fashion research, if you research at all, maybe you don't. Maybe you only research in blogs on the internet, that's also a thing that happens. And if you have a favorite book on fashion, let me know what it is, because that's quite interesting to me. I'm also open to recommendations. Anyway, I hope you had fun. Bye!